Hi students, here we are. We're getting into the Revolutionary War, and it's a good time for you to think about what the Revolutionary War means. Do you think that the Revolutionary War means the battles itself and how and where they're fought, or do you think it's more about the political structure and the socio-ideological view of what it means to be independent? So I want to go through just real briefly the some of the important battles. This is unfortunately is not a class where we get to talk about the battles in detail, mostly because the battles aren't really as important as what led up to it and then what happens after the Revolutionary War. The Battle of Trenton is a fun one to talk about because that's the one where, and you've seen the picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware. It's on Christmas night, and he is kind of doing a sneak attack on the Hessian forces, on the German forces that the British hire. And this is, then we'll see, he'll cross back over and we'll get then to the Battle of Trenton. And so the Battle of Trenton is an important one, but it brings up then Valley Forge. Now, if you know anything about what Valley Forge was like in that winter of 1777, it was a very, very tough time. In fact, more people died in that winter at Valley Forge than I think they did throughout the whole Revolutionary War, more Continental Army forces. And so that was a really tough time. And finally, we see a little bit of glimmer of hope in the Battle of Saratoga. Now, Saratoga is in New York, and actually, if you can see this picture here, this is a famous picture of General Burgoyne, the British officer, surrendering to General Horatio Gates at Saratoga. There's a good map on page 194. I hope between the video that you watched and the reading that you're doing to keep up on this, you kind of understand that this was a very long, drawn-out process. The first shots were fired in 1775. Saratoga isn't until 1777. But it's going to take a long time for us to even get to, say, the Battle of Yorktown. But I want to back up for just a little bit. The Battle of Saratoga is an important turning point. And it's not so much an important turning point for the British as it is for the Americans, because it shows the French that the Americans can go toe-to-toe with the British. Now, keep this idea in mind. The British Empire is the most powerful, probably most well-formed and balanced empire not only Europe, but the world has ever seen. And basically, American forces, the Continental Army, is stopping them. Partly it's because of bad leadership that happened in Saratoga. The British had their opportunity to pounce, and they didn't kind of shut the door. But it brings up the French alliance. Now, this is a really, really important part. You cannot diminish the fact that essentially the Americans won because of the help of the French. Now, keep in mind, the French are probably not real pro-American, but they're definitely anti-British. It would have stemmed back from the Treaty of Paris and the end of the French and Indian War, when the French were pretty much booted out of the United States area and kind of pushed way into the further reaches of Canada. And it's always been this kind of head-to-head competition between the French and the British. And so the French alliance after Saratoga, and the French are kind of like, maybe those Americans aren't as dumb as we think to take on the British Empire. And so the French come and help. There's battle after battle. As much as Saratoga is a turning point in the war, we have a long time until we get to Yorktown. In fact, we don't get to the Battle of Yorktown until 1781. And this is where kind of, if you're going to look at that map for me on page 194, Yorktown is just it's in Virginia, it's south of Washington, D.C., kind of on the Atlantic in the Chesapeake southern area. General Cornwallis is a brilliant strategist, but he gets boxed in, and he kind of boxes himself in. So the French naval forces are on the water. The Continental Army is kind of pushing in from the land, and Cornwallis has to surrender, and that is a really, really big deal. The most powerful empire in the world, arguably, has just had to surrender to kind of a ragtag group of like militiamen and guys with pitchforks. I mean, that's really how the British looked at that. Eventually, we're going to get to another Treaty of Paris of 1783. And I would like you to write this down. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 ends the Revolutionary War. And there are a few big things that come out of that. One, that Britain recognized the United States as an independent nation. I mean, clearly the Declaration of Independence didn't do it, but the Treaty of Paris did. The Mississippi would be considered now the western boundary of America, of the United States, if you will. So everything up to the Mississippi River would be considered the United States. Fishing rights were granted to the United States off the coast of Canada, which was really helpful for those fishing areas and the economies that really relied on the fishing industry. And then the last one, which was a really probably a fair compromise, is that the Americans had to pay back the debts to British merchants and British loyalists. Now, those who were loyalists, and remember there was a big chunk of them, a lot of them would have fled to Canada or actually back to Britain, but those who stayed in the Americas should have been compensated. They should have got their land back. They should have got some of their debt repaid to kind of rebuild their lives again. And so this is kind of ending the Revolutionary War, which is great. It's fantastic. Now we've kind of come to some sort of like unity and agreement, and we can get somewhere. But that means we have to get somewhere, right? Like we have to build a new. Oh, there, I have the surrender of General Burgoyne. By the way, this is John Trumbull, and John Trumbull has painted many different images of, he's the one that he painted the Declaration of Independence, many different early American portraits that I think this one might be in the rotunda of the Capitol. So if you ever get out to Washington, D.C., take a look for this one. Okay, so then this brings up this whole new, we got this country now. We've got this fledgling country. We've just separated ourselves from the most powerful nation in the world. What do we do with this? This is kind of like adulting 101. How do we make this happen? And so there's going to be lots of like issues to deal with, and how is the ideology going to work? And it's really one idea that I want you to kind of focus on, and it's this idea of the consent of the governed. Now this is John Locke's brainchild, right? We've talked about John Locke, and when you come to class, we're going to look at how John Locke, now when John Locke was writing, he was a British man writing in response to the Glorious Revolution like 100 years before. But we're using his ideas. We're going to look at how John Locke's two treatises on government formed and shaped the Declaration of Independence. Very, very influential. Other philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the social contract that your society is only going to be as good and as moral as the people who are making it up. But the idea of the consent of the governed. You remember the slogan, no taxation without representation. The people had to be the one to govern. So now we have to make this work. We have to figure out how it's going to happen, and a lot of that is going to be based on Enlightenment ideas. Oh, there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay, so like I mentioned to you, I want to talk to you when we come to class about comparing, and you already did common sense in your own words. That was really influential. Thomas Paine really got people riled up. If you want to say to what extent was Thomas Paine really influential in gaining support for the independence movement, I would say very strongly he was. Common Sense was a strong document that people got, it was boldly worded, and it got people interested in the independence movement. Again, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence. And on this slide and the next slide, I really want to get into this idea of republicanism and natural rights. And the idea here is we're a republic now. And you know a republic is by the people. It's a government by the people. It's no more primogeniture. It's no more hereditary. Now this is elected officials who represent the people. And you get those rights of life, liberty, and property because you are a human being in that society. So let's, I should probably mention that The independence movement in the United States really sparks a lot of other independence movements in like Haiti and the French Revolution, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Especially in the French Revolution, the French are going to be like, hey, you know, we helped you out in the American Revolution, we helped you win, so you should be helping us. That's a really important one as well. So during and after the American Revolution, an increased awareness in the inequalities. This is also what we're going to be working on on Monday and Tuesday when you come to class. This kind of idea that, I'll put that all up, this idea that how revolutionary was the revolution? You know, the idea of a revolution is it's going to inspire a complete change, and people, no matter where they live or who they are going to be affected by it. Well, how revolutionary was it for people like, say, women? I want to talk about Abigail Adams there real quick. Abigail Adams and her husband, John Adams, you know, our second president, they wrote a lot of letters to each other, and we've been able to have those letters, and we read them, and they were great letter writers. And there's one that Abigail Adams writes to her husband, John, and she hasn't seen him in a while, and she knows that he's working on the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia the spring and summer of 1776. And she says, John, remember the ladies. You know, like, don't let husbands overpower and those who can kind of be the tyrants of the family. Don't let women be kind of shortchanged in this independence movement. Remember the ladies, John. But there's other groups, like, say, free black people. Pennsylvania is the first to grant emancipation. We see it through the Quakers first who do it. And we have abolition societies where now you're allowed to live freely. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is all coming from these ideas. We have some, Vermont now is going to become a state, and they're going to be the first ones to abolish in their constitution slavery itself. There's a statue for religious freedom. This is an interesting one. I want to talk to you about Lord Dunmore. This is Lord Dunmore right here. He established what was called the Ethiopian Regiment. Now, Lord Dunmore was a governor, a royal governor of Virginia, which means he was a British man governing in Virginia. Well, he basically made this proclamation, if you will, of, and this is a statue for him, that if you were a black man, I should say, not woman, but if you were a black man and you fought on the side of the British, you would be granted freedom and emancipation from slavery. Like, you would not be sold into a system of slavery if you were to help the British. This was a pretty important point, because that meant if you're willing to join on one side, you could have your freedom. That was very enticing to a lot of black Americans in especially areas like Virginia. And this brings up this idea then of Republican motherhood. You know, based on these Enlightenment ideas, the idea now, and actually I should say that now we have improved education for women. In fact, now we are making education compulsory for girls and boys at the elementary age. And so the idea of Republican motherhood is you should raise good, faithful, patriotic, upstanding children who would become members of society, who are aware of politics, who are aware of the social fabric, who can really show their patriotism of a unified people. And this was the idea. It was your duty as a mother to teach these values and instill these ideals of republicanism. And don't think of Republican as like Republican and Democrat. Remember, the word republic is by the people. And so you're getting your power, the consent of the government is coming from, or the consent of the people is coming from, the consent for the government is coming from the people. And so this all kind of works together. Oh, there's the Republican That's what I said, the Republican virtues of liberty and natural rights. That is what you were expected to instill in your children. We talked a little bit briefly about the French Revolution, how the French were kind of like, hey, you owe us. That was in 1789. If you think about when the Treaty of Paris happens in 1783, if any of you know me, I am just fascinated with Louis and Marie Antoinette, and this is a fantastic cartoon. I just love it. Apparently, it's probably not actually true, but it's still fun to talk about. Marie Antoinette, people were starving. Paris was in chaos. There's not enough bread. We're having bread riots. And they say, but madame, they don't have any food to eat. There's not even any bread. And she's so like out of touch with the reality. She says, well, then let them eat cake. And so here he has a cartoon and he's saying, it's kind of her last ditch effort to stay away from the guillotine. And she's like, no, I said let them have cake and ice cream. But the important part is to know that the American Revolution really sparked a lot of other independence movements in other areas. The Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, other areas started understanding if they can do it, we can do it as well. We're going to talk about the U.S. Neutrality Proclamation. This is kind of like a George Washington, what you can and cannot do idea, but that's actually going to be something later on that you are going to be assigned, or some of you are going to be assigned. Okay, so this is going to be kind of the last part that I get to. After declaring independence, we had to make a country. Like, how do we make a country? Where do we even start? How do we begin? Because, we came from probably the most economically sound, the most politically organized empire in the world, and now we have to do it ourselves. And so considering what they just came from, a very strong central government with the king as like the head of it, they didn't want to go back to that. And so they have to figure out, do we have a strong central government? A strong federal government? Do we have a strong state government? And so we definitely see the states have a lot more power because they were very scared of having another King George. In fact, when we elect our first president, George Washington is very much like they're a little afraid he was going to take the power the way King George had. And so we have these conventions to ratify their own constitutions. We see Delaware is the first, and it just is coming one after another. And eventually we get to all 13 of the colonies ratifying their state legislature or state constitutions, where eventually we get to the United States Constitution. And they're really on these fundamental laws where consent is coming from the people. You can't just make these laws willy-nilly. But who gets to make these choices? Well, they have to be elected officials. Well, who can be elected? Now we're starting to see like you didn't have to be a landowner in order to vote, but that was only in some states. So there's a lot of differences in some of these ideas. So I actually want to stop right there, and because the next slide is going to be on the Articles of Confederation, and this is a really big one. So I want to stop right here and do a separate video on just the Articles of Confederation and the Great Compromise. So until next time.